Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. It's the 15th of July, 2021, and today was the first day of the 2021 Myanmar Update Conference. This episode is the first in a series of episodes produced at the conference. The podcast presents an edited version of the keynote presentation that opened the conference, with special guest speaker Yanghee Lee, the former United Nations Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Myanmar. Yanghee Lee gives her presentation, which is followed by a lengthy question and answer session. The Myanmar Update seminar is recorded online as well as taking place in person, so the questions can variously be delivered through text and live at the Australian National University. So all questions have been re-recorded and edited for clarity. Introducing Yanghee Lee is Dr. Jonathan Liljeblad, Senior Lecturer at the Australian National University.
Greetings. Thanks everyone for coming. In introducing Professor Yanghee Lee, I've divided my comments into two parts. The first is just a brief rundown of her bio for those of you who aren't familiar with a very long track record in human rights. And then second part is more a personal introduction to sort of discuss my reflections about why it is that we have invited her to be a speaker today. First part with respect to her bio, Professor Yanghee Lee is joining us from Korea at this moment. She's a professor at Sungkyunkwan University in Seoul. Her track record with respect to human rights begins with service as part of the UN Committee on the Convention on the Rights of the Child, for which she served from 2003 to 2013 and was its chair from 2007 to 2011. She was also instrumental in the drafting of the third optional protocol on the Convention on the Rights of the Child with respect to communications procedure. She was also further a chairperson of the chairpersons of treaty bodies from 2010 to 2011, as well as chairperson of the coordinating committee of the special procedures of the UN Human Rights Council from 2016 to 2017. More recently, most of you will recognize her as the Special Rapporteur of Human Rights in Myanmar, and for which she served in that role from 2014 to 2020. And then after that, she was instrumental with the fact-finding mission and the independent investigative mechanism in Myanmar. She is currently working with the Special Advisory Council for Myanmar, also known as SACM, and they're engaging in leading international reactions and activities with respect to the military junta. The second part reflects to some of my personal notes about why we selected Dr. Yanghee Lee to serve as a speaker today. I was teaching human rights in Myanmar at the universities during the time that she was Special Rapporteur. At the time, I shared her comments that she articulated in 2016, at which time she had said that she had hopes that by 2020, Myanmar would have a foundation and would be on its way towards growing a stable regime for human rights. Since that time, history has proven otherwise, but I think a lot of what's happened now was presaged by events of that time period. In particular, what I make note of is that when I was inside the country, I was somewhat taken aback by Myanmar's refusal of granting Dr. Yanghee Lee entrance to the country, so it impeded her ability to perform her functions as a special rapporteur. The reason I found this somewhat alarming was because in denying entrance to Dr. Yanghee Lee, it serviced the goals of anti-human rights forces within the country. Specifically, it emboldened two camps. The first, I call it the xenophobic camp. This is the selection of voices that claimed Myanmar exceptionalism. They saw human rights as a form of foreign imperialism, and very much followed the lines of argumentation that had been exercised by the Asian values cultural relativist debates from the 1990s. The second group, I call this a selective camp. These were the voices that claimed human rights existed for some people, but not all people. And on that basis, justified a systematic campaign of human rights violations against particular minorities. And in doing so, they contradicted the very universal foundations of the international human rights system. We call it the Universal Declaration of Human Rights for a reason. In denying entrance to Yanghee Lee, Myanmar's leaders signaled not only support for these anti-human rights camps, but they also signaled to the international community that they were resisting international efforts to promote human rights within the country. They had forgotten one of the truths, the fundamental truths of those of us who are human rights scholars, that in protecting human rights for others, we are supporting the growth of human rights for ourselves. And it's those rights that are very much in dire need now at this time. So as a result of that, the ulterior goal for today's talk from Professor Lee was to give a forum to the issues of human rights, issues which are very much of concern at this moment in time. So I want to ask all of you to please welcome Dr. Yanghee Lee, and we will look forward to towards her comments, and we will expect your questions at the end of her talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Oh, that was a wonderful introduction, so flattering. Thank you very much. I would like to begin by thanking the ANU College of Asia and the Pacific for inviting me here today. It is my greatest honor to kick off this incredible 3-day conference devoted to the situation in Myanmar as the nation is grappling with the unlawful coup and the COVID pandemic. More than 5 months ago, Myanmar, a country that was on its way toward democracy, was set back with the horrific unlawful coup attempted by the Telenor. The attempted coup staged by the Telenor on the 1st of February has not succeeded. And I think I want to put this underscored in bold letters, has not succeeded. The people of Myanmar have so far been incredibly effective in resisting the Temenor's attempt to seize power by mobilizing massive peaceful protests, a nonviolent civil disobedience movement, the CDM, and strikes by public and private sector workers. The National Unity Government has been set up, and the 2008 Constitution nulled by the committee representing Pyidaungsu Hluttaw. The anti-coup civilian democracy movement has demonstrated the unrelenting strength of opposition, public opposition in Myanmar to military dictatorship, and has held out against one of the most vicious and oppressive militaries in the world. On the other side, the military generals are using the security forces to inflict a deliberate process of killings and other forms of terror on the civilian population, the very population they are supposed to protect. They have resorted to terrorist-like behaviors using fighter jets, arson, gas bombs, and snipers. This is consistent with the strategies used repeatedly by the Telenor against Myanmar's ethnic nationalities. During my term as the Special Rapporteur between 2014 and 2020, I reported on countless acts of brutality committed by the Telenor and security forces against Myanmar's ethnic nationalities and religious minorities. I was the first to raise the alarm for what the Telenor was about to do in August 2017, 2 weeks before it went all out and committed genocide against the Rohingya living in Rakhine State. We have witnessed numerous massacres to date, from Yangon to Mandela to Bago, Chin, Kachin, literally all around Myanmar. Besides the killings, we are seeing arrests of medical doctors supporting the democracy movement. We are also seeing torture and enforced disappearances. Internet shutdowns have become the norm in recent months. Arrests and detention of journalists prevail. Licenses of independent media outlets revoked and their offices raided. Now the illegal junta is weaponizing the COVID pandemic against its own people by banning sales of oxygen cylinders to civilians and withholding treatment of affected persons. As of 13 July, AAPP reports approximately 906 innocent lives killed, 6,676 arrested in total, 5,239 still detained, and 1,963 arrest warrants issued. Among the dead are children, and very young children have been and are still being detained. Let me address how the international community responded to atrocities in Myanmar. Back in 2016, The Tatmadaw conducted a so-called, quote unquote, clearance operation, which was literally a security operation that drove tens of thousands of Rohingya to Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. The international community only condemned and deplored. The next year, the Tatmadaw went ahead with a massive offensive against the Rohingya in 2017. Still yet, the international community condemned in the strongest and deplored at the highest. The Security Council could not even agree on a resolution. This, in my view, has emboldened the Tatmadaw. Now, the Tatmadaw is doing the exact same thing they did on all peoples, beyond the ethnic minorities and to the Rohingya for decades. The strongest response by the Security Council since the unlawful coup came in the form of a president's statement in March 10 of this year. It strongly condemned the violence and expressed its continued support for the democratic transition in Myanmar. Furthermore, it expressed strong support for regional organizations, in this case, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN. An ASEAN summit was planned, but was eventually scaled down to an ASEAN leaders meeting, which was held on 24th of April. It was attended by 9 ASEAN leaders and 1 Myanmar military commander-in-chief, Min Aung Hlaing. A 5-point consensus on the situation in Myanmar was reached. The consensus included the following: immediate cessation of violence, constructive dialogue between all parties, the appointment of an ASEAN special envoy, provision of humanitarian assistance through the ASEAN Humanitarian Assistance Center, and that the special envoy and delegation visit Myanmar to meet all parties concerned. A glaring omission in the consensus was the release of Aung San Suu Kyi, the president, and other government officials. Some say the ASEAN consensus was a major breakthrough. However, I view this as a tentative starting point, nothing more. It has opened the path for a process in response to the crisis in Myanmar. To move forward, the consensus must be followed by concrete action from ASEAN and international engagement with the national unity government in Myanmar. The utmost priority is to stop the rampant violence and killings committed by the security forces. Unfortunately, right after the announcement of the consensus on 26th of April, the Tatmadaw issued a press release stating that it would merely give careful consideration to the consensus agreed with the ASEAN leaders. Meanwhile, Min Aung Hlaing's troops have continued to commit violence and murder. Moreover, almost 3 months after this consensus was reached, ASEAN has not appointed a special envoy yet. I'd like to address some of the recent actions taken by the international community, a little bit more hopeful. Significant developments have taken place in recent weeks. First of all, after repeated failure of the Security Council to take concrete action, the UNGA voted and passed the resolution A/75/L.85/Rev 1, calling on member states to, quote unquote, prevent the flow of arms into Myanmar on 18 June. Finally, however, it did not go so far as we had hoped for a global arms embargo, but it did demand the military to immediately stop all violence against peaceful protest demonstrators. It was not passed by consensus. A vote was taken, and it was approved by 119 countries, 36 abstentions, including China, and 1 country, Belarus, voted against it. Just a few days ago, this week, the Human Rights Council adopted by consensus the resolution A/47/L.11 regarding the situation of human rights of Rohingya Muslims and other minorities in Myanmar. Of note, it called for repealing and replacing the Citizenship Law of 1982. What can the international community do now to support the democracy movement? The situation in Myanmar underlines the importance of tackling impunity and ensuring accountability for atrocity crimes. Min Aung Hlaing, the head of the Tetmadol, who led the coup and is directing attacks against civilians, and the fact-finding mission recommended should be prosecuted for genocide in Rakhine and war crimes and crimes against humanity there and in other states. It is now time for the international community to turn the table on the Tetmadol with what we call a three cuts approach, comprising of a comprehensive global arms embargo, targeted sanctions against the architects of the coup, and a referral of the situation in Myanmar to the International Criminal Court by the Security Council. And I will explain what I mean by we call for the three cuts. Financial action could be the most effective route in the short term. The Myanmar military controls a multi-billion-dollar business enterprise, which allows it to operate with impunity. Cutting off these funds will be key to pressuring the Tetmadol to end violence and relinquish power. Military's two largest companies, Myanmar Economics Holdings Limited and the Myanmar Economic Commission Corporation, must be sanctioned as a matter of urgency. States and donors must find ways to ensure desperately needed humanitarian assistance reaches urban as well as ethnic areas where members of the democracy movement have fled from the Tetmadol. Local networks in these areas already have decades of experience responding to the humanitarian crises caused by the Tetmadol's brutality and should direct these efforts there. The Advisory Council, a special advisory council for Myanmar, was formed 1 month after the attempted unlawful coup. Two other founding members, Marzuki Darusman and Chris Sidoti, who were both members of the UN Independent International Fact-Finding Mission on Myanmar, and myself were approached by Myanmar civil society groups asking us to support their efforts fighting for human rights, peace, democracy, justice, and accountability in Myanmar. During our UN mandates, all three of us founding members had been resolute on the need for an end to the Myanmar military's impunity for its decades of human rights violations committed against the peoples of Myanmar. So we three resolved to form SACM and continue our work. SACM is calling for three cuts here to addressing the situation in Myanmar. Cut the weapons, cut the cash, and cut the impunity. Key actions that the Security Council could take include the following: imposing an arms embargo to prevent the use of weapons against its own people, introducing a sanctions regime against those who are responsible for attacks against civilians and their business enterprises, referring the situation in Myanmar to the International Criminal Court. We welcome the sanctions that various governments placed on military leaders, the military's conglomerates, MEHL and MEC, and more recently, the Myanmar Gems Enterprise and the timber sector. These moves are positive and directly target the junta's source of finance, which it uses to resource its campaign of terror and atrocities against the peoples of Myanmar. It is hard to tell exactly what the impact of the sanctions has been in the short term, but what I can say is that it is an extremely important symbolic move for the democracy movement inside the country. They feel abandoned by the international community. Actions like this show them that they are not forgotten, and it gives them encouragement to keep going. There seems to be some indications that the sanctions are taking effect. The illegal junta is now reportedly auctioning off items such as timber and other goods to foreign countries. In terms of further action, it is extremely important that sanctions are placed on the Myanmar Oil and Gas Enterprise, MOGE. This is the junta's largest source of revenue and access to foreign currency, which it uses to buy weapons. There are powerful companies such as Chevron lobbying against sanctions on MOGE. More recently, it has been reported that U.S. Treasury Department sanctioned nearly 24 people connected to the Myanmar military, including 4 Coup government ministers, 3 members of the SAC, State Administrative Council, and 15 spouses or adult children of designated individuals. The U.S. Commerce Department announced restrictions on exports to 4 companies with ties to the Myanmar military. Wanbao Mining Limited and its 2 Myanmar subsidiaries, Myanmar Wanbao Mining Copper Limited and Myanmar Yanghee Copper Limited. They are copper mining companies that have revenue sharing agreements with MEHL. MEHL has been sanctioned by the US, UK, EU, and Canada. In addition, China South Industries Group and China North Industries Group both have been newly added to the U.S. Department of Treasury's list. These companies are directly tied to making weapons. In recent weeks, the EU sanctioned 8 individuals and others and designated 4 entities, including Myanmar Gems Enterprise and Myanmar Timber Enterprise and the Myanmar War Veterans Organization, which provides support to former members of the Myanmar military, and the Forest Products Joint Venture Corporation Limited, a state-controlled entity that processes teak and hardwood. The Myanmar Pearl Enterprise and the SAC, the military administration running the Coup government, have all been sanctioned by the UK. All of these developments are important in cutting the cash flow into the illegal junta and must be followed by other governments. Of importance is that there is the other side of sanctions. Money shouldn't be going to the illegal junta. It should be going to the NUG so that it can provide services to the people and advance democracy. Governments should look to see whether assets belonging to the Myanmar state held in their respective governments may be frozen under sanctions regimes to avoid them from being stolen by the illegal junta and to be later released to the NUG. The crisis in Myanmar is also a crisis of impunity. The military has never faced justice for the decades of atrocities it has committed against the peoples of Myanmar, especially the ethnic minorities, including the Rohingya. Ending impunity is key. Individual members of the Security Council must push the Security Council to refer the situation in Myanmar to the International Criminal Court. Moreover, more governments can join Canada and Netherlands in supporting the case brought against Myanmar by the Gambia under the Genocide Convention at the International Court of Justice. In my report to the General Assembly in 2019, I called for home governments of multinational companies investing in Myanmar to take all steps necessary to prevent human rights violations in Myanmar by business enterprises domiciled in their territory and or jurisdiction. This brings me to the final point, cutting the impunity. The Telenor must immediately be referred to the International Criminal Court for its crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. During my mandate as a special rapporteur, I called for the following 4 things: referral to the ICC, referral to the ICJ, which the Gambia has taken up, application of universal jurisdiction, which Argentina has taken up, establishment of an ad hoc international tribunal. A peaceful solution will come from the peoples of Myanmar and the NUG. At the same time, support must be given to the people and the NUG in the form of humanitarian and political assistance. This means recognition of the NUG as the legitimate government. If the international community will not go down in history of once again failing the peoples of Myanmar. The National Unity Government has been formed by the democratic forces in Myanmar as the legitimate government of the country. The NUG derives its legitimacy from the November 2020 general elections, but also through the broad coalition it formed amongst the peoples of Myanmar, including the ethnic groups and protest groups. It is this broad coalition represented by the NUG that has the potential to end the decades of civil war and military oppression in Myanmar. In conclusion, I would like to read you a recent article by Radio Free Asia, posted on 8 July. A 5-year-old girl whose father helped organize protests against Myanmar's junta was forced to endure stress positions during more than 2 weeks in detention, according to her father, making her what observers say was the country's youngest known political prisoner under the military regime that seized power in February. Today, I will not go into details of how this demonstrates flagrant violation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, to which Myanmar is a party. There have been other cases of children as young as 2 and 4 who had been detained because the junta could not find their parents or their relatives when they came to search their homes. So instead, they took their children. But I will say this, what will the international community tell this young girl years later why she had to go through this horrific treatment at the age of 5? What did she do wrong? Where were the adults of the international community? I end with this very somber note, and I thank you for your attention. And I am waiting for your questions, and thank you for having me here again.
Now we have an edited version of the Q&A section of the seminar. Questions came via text in the chat box of the Zoom platform, as well as being read aloud in person at the Australian National University. The first question is by Professor Ward Keeler. He asks, do you think that if Aung San Suu Kyi were able to regain her position, would she amend her attitude toward the Rohingya?
It is very difficult for me to speculate what she will do. But judging from what she has done in the past, I don't know how forthcoming she will be and how soon she will amend, as you say, amend her attitude and behavior towards the Rohingya. But I have to say this, that there are 2 objectives of politicians. Aung San Suu Kyi is a politician through and through. The 2 objectives are getting elected and getting re-elected. And in order to get elected and re-elected, they have to respond to the constituency, which was the Bama majority. Now, I see a tremendous shift in the sentiment of the people, even with the Bama majority. So now that there is a shift in sentiment, perhaps Aung San Suu Kyi will listen to that shift in sentiment and amend her attitude towards the Rohingya.
The next question comes from Thurain Nguyen, who asks, what are the barriers to getting official recognition by the UN for the National Unity Government?
It will be a long answer, but to make it short, right now, the biggest hurdle would be this will unfold in September at the GA. Currently, Ujo Myotun, the permanent representative appointed by the previous NLD government, who's the sitting permanent representative in New York, he still has a seat there for 1 year. The SAC has condemned him and called for the United States to send him back, and also charged him with horrific charges. So until then, Jo Myotun can refute all the things that the current illegal junta is saying to the world. But this will have to go through a credentials committee during the beginning of the high-level panel in September in New York. once that happens, then if the NUG or Jomyotun will still be recognized as the seat holder of Myanmar for another year, then that's a major victory for NUG. I have to say that WHO and ILO, both congresses, have deferred their decision on who will represent Myanmar in May to the General Assembly. And the UPR session was postponed because in those fora, there was a lot of opposition, and rightfully so, that the SAC appointed representative or this illegal junta should not represent Myanmar. So this is the process that we have to work towards. As I said, more governments need to recognize that NUG is the legitimate government and cooperate with NUG in all ways it can.
The next question is from one of the conveners of the conference, Dr. Nick Cheeseman. He asks, sanctions were ineffective in the 1990s and 2000s. How could they be different this time?
Well, these will be more targeted sanctions. And as I said, finding companies and subsidiaries of businesses and enterprises in Myanmar that are affiliated to MEC or MEHL or the military family, the big family of the military generals, and also finding assets in, as I said, respective countries and freezing those assets in these respective countries will have a different effect this time. As I said, there is another side to the sanctions. I know people are very cautious when we discuss sanctions because will it not put Myanmar back to those times that Myanmar was suffering to exit from? These are not blanket sanctions. These will be targeted sanctions against the junta and the military leadership so that their pockets, their wallets will not become full. The only thing they'll do is buy more weapons or enlarge their wallets for themselves and their families, not for the people of Myanmar.
The next question is from an anonymous conference attendee and asks, could you please expand on the processes of bringing the Tatmadaw or the State Administration Council to justice at the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice?
Right now, the Gambia has initiated at the end of last year a case to the ICJ under the Convention of the Genocide Convention. The ICJ came out with a unanimous decision and announced its provisional measures for Myanmar. Myanmar needs to submit a interim report, and I think it was June. I believe the junta has submitted a report, but also it is important for the NUG to also submit a report, or at least recognition that, yes, indeed, genocide did happen in Myanmar, and more countries have joined since the Gambia, as I said, Canada and the Netherlands, and of course Maldives had joined earlier. But if more countries can join this initiative by the Gambia, it will give more force, more power to the recognition that Myanmar, the Tatmadaw, had indeed committed genocide.
The next question from Hunter Marston, a PhD candidate at the Australian National University, is, do you see any role for the United Nations, especially humanitarian organs, to work with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations in advancing diplomacy regarding Myanmar?
It almost seemed like the UN and ASEAN were playing this ping pong game. I really think that now ASEAN has to really deliver on what it said it would do. They've reached a 5-point consensus and they must deliver. And the UN also cannot be dragging its feet. I'm encouraged to see that the General Assembly has taken on board the arms flow resolution and has gone with a vote. And the numbers is very telling, is that there is a strong support for the democracy movement of Myanmar. And recently, in the Human Rights Council, the resolution was adopted by consensus. It didn't go to a vote. So that's very encouraging to see that there is international agreement that they will not recognize the illegal junta.
The next question is a general thematic question, a combination of 3 individual questions posed from the floor. It regards the role of China and Russia and Yanghee Lee's opinion about international relations and what other countries can do to prevent the Myanmar SAC from deepening its engagement with China and Russia at the exclusion of other nations.
Well, I've said a lot against China and Russia, and I'm sure some of you have already heard some of the things that I said about them. China's been sitting on the fence these days, and right now what concerns me is Min Aung Hlaing's stance towards Russia. His démarche with Russia and more engagements with Russia. Russia is now, and the Defense Ministry of Russia has succeeded in selling more arms, weapons to Myanmar, where Russia and China were probably the top 2 countries that were selling arms to Myanmar. But now Russia is gaining more ground in arms export to Myanmar. That's really concerning. Whereas China has a lot invested in Myanmar, and China should not say that it's an internal matter. And because it has a lot of financial investments, the BRI, and it has a sizable Chinese population historically too, and it borders Myanmar. So I really think, and it's interesting to see that China abstained instead of voted against the resolution of the arms flow. Maybe it's telling us that China is now thinking of coming down from the fence and taking a more direct role without meddling. But China has all the levers that can move or make the junta change its course. But this is something that China is probably very cautiously debating, because once they start to move in and take more direct actions, it could push Min Aung Hlaing and the junta closer to Russia. And so here we are. We have the 2 permanent 5 members of the Security Council who, because of those 2 seats, the Security Council has never been able to come up with any resolution so far. And I think it's really a shame that they are still sitting there and not doing what is in the best interest of the peoples of Myanmar, and not only thinking about what's in the best interest of their own respective countries.
The next question comes from an unidentified attendee who asks, do you see any room for possible negotiation or reconciliation between Aung San Suu Kyi and the Tatmadaw?
Well, my concern is that the Tatmadaw might use Aung San Suu Kyi to their benefit and to use this card to crush the democratic movement. So that's where my biggest concern is. I'm being very cautious that whatever negotiations will likely take place, I hope that Aung San Suu Kyi will make a very sensible decision.
The next question is from an unidentified attendee who asks, in the current context of the COVID-19 pandemic and the actions being taken by the State Administration Council and its delegates against healthcare workers who are participating in the civil disobedience movement, do you have any thoughts about things that the international community can do to provide aid for these healthcare workers and for all of the COVID-19 victims in Myanmar?
We don't want the international community or international donors to cooperate with the military, illegal junta. We can leverage neighboring countries. China, Thailand, and India should open up their borders so that the necessary assistance reaches the ethnic areas. Ethnic areas, people think that Myanmar is going to be a failed state or is failing. But in ethnic areas, you have clinics that are operating, schools are operating. They've had networks and institutions that were able to carry on the work or the job that the central government didn't for decades. And so once these borders are open to go into the ethnic areas, there is, and using the networks, community-based organization networks, and to liaise with the CDM, physicians and other civil servants, to transport the necessary medical equipment into the center of Myanmar, I think it can work. And this is an avenue, an area that the international community, the UN, and all agencies must consider. I think this will be the creative way of trying to deliver the necessary services and assistance to the people, not to the junta.
Yanghee Lee's next question was also from an unidentified participant who comments and then asks, when you use the example of South Africa, there is a view that Nelson Mandela was kept in prison for too long and that he had passed his use-by date. Similarly, a senior Indian diplomat recently said that Aung San Suu Kyi has passed her use-by date. Is it time for the young guns in the country to take over the movement?
I hope I don't get misunderstood. Aung San Suu Kyi has been the moral voice, the guiding force in the peoples of Myanmar for decades. She will still remain as the guiding force. But I think for a future, there needs to be a different fabric of leadership that will lead Myanmar into the future. The young generation and not so young generation too, people in their middle ages, must be tasked more to build a new Myanmar. And this comes with the alliance and cooperation with the ethnic minorities too.
The next question comes from Mike Hayes, who asks, is there any scope for the often underused mechanisms such as universal jurisdiction or extraterritorial obligations to be used? Are they of any use?
Well, yes and no. Yes, most likely, we've seen some war criminals who were arrested in different parts of the world. And Argentina has taken this up. And I do hope that more countries can decide to do this. Then you have the question of, for instance, if Australia says we're going to invoke universal jurisdiction, the Min Aung Hlaing will not go to Australia. But if more countries start to do this, it really sends a message to the leadership of the Telenor. And in addition, it's not just the top Min Aung Hlaing and his deputy commander-in-chief. You have scores of generals and lieutenant generals who were directly involved in carrying out the previous genocide against the Rohingya and currently involved in carrying out this unlawful coup.
Susan Banky asks, Thailand has grown to be an increasingly hostile place for exiles and refugees. At the same time, there remains a vibrant set of young activists protesting against the Myanmar military government from within Thailand. So what is Thailand's role either from the government or from the civil society side?
Thailand has been in a very unique position for decades in regards to not only Myanmar, but other parts of the Southeast Asian countries. But more so for Myanmar in recent years and recent months is that it shares a long border with Myanmar. And if Thailand, as I said, opens up its borders to let assistance enter the borders, or the other way around, I do know that we have this backdrop, this horrific COVID pandemic, which really all countries are starting to close their borders because they cannot cope with the upsurge, the third or the fourth wave of the pandemic. But in the situation of Myanmar and Thailand, many have tried to escape from Myanmar into the border of Thailand. And I've been hearing that recently there's been a lot of pushback, and they're pushing them back to Myanmar because, of course, all countries, and rightfully so too, but sometimes too much excuses relied on the COVID. We can't cope with this influx in COVID. Thailand has to remember that this virus, coronavirus, has no borders. It has no boundaries. That even if they put up a huge wall preventing refugees from Myanmar coming into Thailand, there's going to be an increase in cases. And so I think it would be important for Thailand for once to do the right thing. And this is where the international community can assist Thailand to setting up makeshift clinics, hospital centers, treatment centers along the border cities of Thailand, so that people fleeing from the persecution can come over to Thailand, and vice versa, letting the borders open so that necessary assistance can go in to the ethnic areas to be delivered into central Myanmar.
The next question comes from Jonathan Liljeblad, who introduced Yanghee Lee at the beginning of this podcast and chaired the Q&A session from Canberra. Jonathan inquired further about the recommendations from the Special Advisory Council for Myanmar.
We have been talking to many of these governments so that first and foremost, that these governments must cut the cash flow, sever ties with military conglomerates or associates or subsidiaries. For Korea, Republic of Korea, we have a major company called POSCO, who is funneling in some money to MOGE, and we've been calling for stopping that too. But also for governments to engage with NUG in providing the necessary political and humanitarian assistance, suspending ODA, Overseas Development Assistance, and securing those funds into an escrow account so that when the NUG can resume, or the NLD or the NUG can resume governing, that these money can be used to funnel to funnel that work. And we are calling for countries to, as I said, recognize NUG, but as a legitimate government. But many governments have these various reasons for, why legally that's not possible. But you can, as I say, engage with NUG, withhold ODA, support the work of the NUG through various means. And this is the position of SACAN.
The next question from an unidentified attendee asks Yanghee Lee to give her opinions about the general economic conditions prevailing inside Myanmar.
Well, the banks are non-functioning. There's an incredible queue in front of banks to collect, to get money from even the ATMs. And there are reports that the SAC, the State Administrative Council, was charging exorbitant fees just for people to withdraw money from their own account. The economy, in the sense of the banking system, is not working. And many CDM supporters have not gotten paid. And so, there's been UNDP report and UNFPA report about the food shortage and how people will suffer from poverty in the near future. But we see the resilient communities where people are chipping in, people are setting up markets where people come in with the produce and say, take whatever you can and donate what you don't need. And this is happening in Yangon and Mandela in the central part of Myanmar. But things like this is continuously happening in the ethnic areas, and which has survived in the ethnic areas. And yes, the economic situation is very dire. And this is exactly why that countries should suspend ODAs, should sever ties with the military affiliated conglomerates, and direct those funds to more creative ways where it will get into and support the lives of the civilian population in Myanmar.
An unidentified attendee asks Yanghee Lee, can you give your perspective on the reasons why the Tatmadaw staged the coup on the 1st of February?
The reasons are very, stems from the greed and corruption of Min Aung Hlaing. His term would have ended in June as the commander-in-chief, and he would have to let go of all the financial powers he and his family currently enjoy. And I think that has been the driving force behind this coup, is that he did not want to lose that power. And I do know there's been some speculation or rumors that, of course, since the 2015 election, he wanted to assume the position of the president, and that was not granted by the NLD or Aung San Suu Kyi. And he had also hoped again in 2020 that there would be this kind of an agreement or an arrangement where he will be the president. And by being the president, he effectively will continue to enjoy his financial powers. And that didn't happen. And so the two reasons are greed and corruption of Min Aung Hlaing and his close network of generals.
The next question, which is paraphrased from unidentified attendees, asks Yanghee Lee to return to the topic of COVID-19 and give her remarks about the current situation, especially in urban areas.
I've seen surprising numbers, like thousands being reported daily in the past few days. But that doesn't mean those are accurate figures. Not all the hospitals are non-functioning. Most hospitals are non-functioning, and the testing of COVID cases is not accurately being carried out. And so these are the numbers that we are seeing now are under-reported numbers. And I understand that there has been cases found even in the ethnic areas where they have had no cases in the past.
The next question is again from Jonathan Liljeblad, and he asks, what are the implications for Telenor's recent sale in Myanmar and the fact that now all remaining telecommunications companies are sympathetic to the Tatmadaw or the State Administration Council?
Well, I personally have not been all that satisfied with some of the inactions that Telenor didn't go as far enough when in the past, during the times when the 2016 and 2017 genocide was occurring too. But Telenor had started to stand up against some of the ridiculous restrictions that the junta was placing on telecommunications. Now that they've sold to M1 company, which has ties with Mytel. Mytel, as you know, is a military-owned telecommunications company. And so telecommunications will now be totally owned, as you said, by those who favor the junta. And this is very alarming. And we hope that when there is the guiding principles of business and human rights. And when Telenor was still operating in Myanmar, I used to call for them to adhere to business and human rights. But I think this has to go beyond when they're operating. I'm not just referring to Telenor, but for international, multinational corporations, is when they decide to sell off. And I know people might say, oh, she is so naive, she doesn't know what she's saying. But I think the decision to sell and to whom they will sell, I think that the guiding principles of business and human rights should extend. For instance, here in this case of the the service users, is the privacy of the users must be kept secure or protected during the sales negotiations or decisions. I'm also very concerned with the spyware that's been purchased right before the coup, and more spywares will emerge. And I think that now this is an area that is going to create a havoc in terms of the people in Myanmar, but also in terms of the international community to deal with. Is you have COVID pandemic and you have this highly sophisticated intelligence surveillance technology available to the junta.
As we reach the 1 hour mark, the final question comes from Aung, who asks, how should the international community and Myanmar people prepare if the State Administration Council in Tatmadaw maintains its control of Myanmar for the next 20 or even 30 years?
Let's not look that far. And I stress this to everyone inside Myanmar, all the parties in Myanmar. In the ethnic areas, we've witnessed 70 years of civil war. Now it's going to, more violence is protracting into the center of Myanmar. If the international community does not support the NUG, and if the NUG and the EAOs do not cooperate and let all the past differences aside, it will be a lost opportunity. And this is the perfect chance now that for once the EAOs, ethnic states and ethnic minorities, are now coming together with the Bama majorities and the NLD government and NUG to try to work things out. And so this is an opportunity where ASEAN, the UN, and other individual states, governments must go the extra mile to support. Otherwise, I don't know what there will be in store for Myanmar. It's going to be misery for the people of Myanmar, not for the military junta.
So on that somber note, I think we've come to the end of our time. So thank you for your comments and your answers. So everyone, please give a round of applause for Professor Lee.
Thank you very much. Thank you.